help us to understand two various currents that meet in the papacy of Leo XIII. One current is the revival of Thomism, and then the other current would be the development of Catholic social doctrine. And one way so I think there's an important question, right, that we always have to ask and at some point answer in our lives. And that's whether history, especially political history, is it just a matter of some mysterious forces at work? Is it the spirit of the age at work? Or are there humans or are there persons who act in some way and whose actions have consequences, or whose actions have effects? And the danger, I think in general, most political history and many people who participate in politics, there is almost like a pretense that there are some sort of blind forces at work, right? That there's a spirit of the times. And somehow there's a spirit somehow that's always moving us to recognize, like, what's the next big political event or how we should react in this circumstance. Almost as if there's no human cause at work in history, or as there's no personal cause at work in history. So the danger, though, of arguing that there are persons that can work in history and that these persons can do things that have effects, is that gets you into conspiracy theory, right? So as Carl Schmitt once time explained to me, he said, this was on my first philosophy semester, Carl Schmitt said, conspiracies happen all the time. How do you know a conspiracy? Well, what is the word conspiracy? What does it come from? Conspirare, to breathe together. If there's two people that are in a room and they come up with a plan and they're breathing together, they don't get COVID, they form a conspiracy. So if you're not aware of a conspiracy, it's about time that you start one.
So you mean COVID is a conspiracy?
Conclude what you will. And actually, so we saw a little bit in the French Revolution how one of the things that propelled the guillotine, and one of the things that propelled the terror, was that the revolutionaries thought that there was a conspiracy behind every corner, right? So there is one meaning of conspiracy, which is that, well, you think people are acting, but they're not. But then there's another, I think the other extreme is the modern use of it, which is basically when you know, this came up when certain political individuals know that they've come up with a theory or an explanation of events, and they know that theory is false, and they don't want to debate it anymore, they accuse the one who questions it as being a conspiracy theorist, right? That's more of the modern usage. Or if I just coming over here, someone made some accusation to me about something, and like also if you really don't understand what someone's saying, if one person really doesn't understand what someone is saying about an issue or a topic that could be complicated, an easy way to discard it and to not face the issue is to say, oh, that's just conspiracy theory. So, but I think in this case, I want to speak about conspiracy theories. So, for example, the rise of Thomism, it was a full-fledged conspiracy. You have to admit it, and once you know the details. I think in the very good sense of the word, conspiracy. And actually, you can read all about it. One place that one author who writes all about this is a guy named Gerard McCool, who writes about the rise and the history of Neo-Thomism in the 19th and the 20th century. Another fellow who writes about it, who puts together a number of German and American sources, is in this book, Logos Rising, Chapter 10, Klutkin and the Retreat from History. Klutkin was one of the figures that became an essential figure in the rise of Neo-Thomism. And if you'll be patient with me, I think it's so. How did? And I think it's interesting. to go back and to see how these things rise. Because how these things rise, it gives us, I think, practical things, practical suggestions that we can do that may not have immediate political implications. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But there are things that we can do that have long-term political implications, and both for society and for the church. And so that's why sometimes I think it's good to know about these things. And sometimes I think also we can see people with whom we even disagree with who have done things that are conspiratorial in nature, in the good sense of conspiracy. In other words, they come together and they come up with a plan and they try to implement it in time, in space and time. So, and that I think it's significant. There's a great quote that I read today that one of the real problems that develops between 1830 and 1848, and even up until 1870, is the way it's put, I think, is very interesting, right? That philosophy retreated from space and time during that epoch. And when philosophy retreated from space and time during that epoch, it was replaced with either nihilism or some sort of scientific pragmatism, whether it was Marxist scientific pragmatism or capitalist scientific pragmatism, but basically people who were not willing to use reason to articulate and justify what they were doing in society. And so society at that point becomes a contest of wills, right? And how do you resolve a contest of wills but through violence? So that's, I think, a little bit the danger. You can see this at any moment in a society where when the leadership of a society, whether it's a religious or whether it's a political society, but when it starts resorting to commands without reason to explain them, right? Or the authority of experts without coming up with reasons to explain what they're doing. Obviously, sometimes in the healthy exercise of authority, Yves Simon has this great little book called A General Theory of Authority. It's like 120 pages. It's easy. It's an easy read. It's a great book. It's one of the best little books I've ever read that you'll never read. Right? Even David Gallagher recommends the book. That says something. A General Theory of Authority, Yves Simon. It's eminently readable. It has a great chapter on the common good. And it has a great chapter on even just the first 2 or 3 chapters are worth it. Because 4, 5, and 6 are then just authority applied to various situations. It's a great book. It's so easy to read. It's a delight. And it makes you a great authoritarian. And we all need to become great authoritarians. No, it's a great book about what is authority and how to but even so, Yves Simon says, obviously, right? What is authority? The whole purpose of authority is to give direction to the community towards the common good. I mean, that's it, right? Authority. The point of authority is to give direction of the community towards the common good. It's clear. You see this in running centers. You see this in running societies. There can be good people who have good intentions and good desires, and they can disagree on what means you should implement and what means should be implemented in order to achieve the common good. And sometimes they can disagree on means that are both good to achieve the common good. So I think the example that Simone gives is the family's going to go on vacation, right? The father might say, we should go to the beach, right? We should go to this beach in Michigan, on Lake Michigan. And the wife might say, no, we should go to a beach on a little inland beach that's 40 miles away from Lake Michigan. Well, both could be, let's just assume, both are equally as good of beaches, and equally as good of lakes. The difference might be, you might get a little bit of a different sunset on Lake Michigan than on the lake. But those are just qualitative differences. But there's no fundamental difference as far as the good. Well, at some point, the authority has to decide. And in those cases, what should the husband do? He should listen for what his wife wants to do, And in the moment, he shouldn't acknowledge that he heard what she wanted to do. But then at some point later on, 2 or 3 hours later, he should say, you know what? I think we should go to that beach. I think that's the best thing we could do. And then everybody's happy because the husband makes the decision. He exercises leadership in the family. He does it by listening to his disciples, his students, his citizens, and he chooses everything in a spirit of service for the others, right? So that's the ideal. That's the ideal scenario. Just like Saint Joseph, right? So the point of, if we go back then now to this origin of Thomism, again, we were saying by the time you get to the French Revolution, in the seminaries, for the most part, even in Rome, there was no Thomism. So finally, there was this one Italian who kind of rose through the system, a guy named Tapparelli, Luigi Tapparelli d'Azeglio. He became a professor at the Gregorian in the 1820s, and he was a closet Thomist. He would read St. Thomas at night in his little room there, and there were two younger people came through the Gregorian. One was his last name was Curci, and another one that came through the Gregorian was Kleutkin. And then a third, Curci. So Curci came to the Gregorian as a young professor, and I think he was a Scotist. I think he was a Scotist of some sort. But through friendship, Kleutkin convinced Curci to become a Thomist. So Curci, after he got whatever his tenure was, becomes a Thomist. And the two of them become convinced. They kind of convince each other. We have to set the course of the church right. Because there's all these philosophers who had gone over to Lockeanism or Rousseauianism of some sort. There was kind of an emerging traditionalism. So in Germany, there was this whole battle going on in the 1820s, from 1810 to 1830 or so. One school was led by a guy named Hermes, Hermes. And Hermes was essentially a naturalist who said that we have to go back into human consciousness and we have to try to discover the primordial experiences of human consciousness. And we have to direct the church according to those lines. And Hermes was very effective at basically getting anybody who was like a convinced other than naturalist. Basically, Hermes was a great political operator. He could use the government. He was very effective at using the government to get anybody that was quasi-Thomist or even Scotist just kind of booted out of the German university system, kind of controlling the chairs and controlling who got appointments. So essentially, some Germans, like Kleutkin was one of the Germans that became a Thomist, and he saw this happening. And so they began to think, more and more, we're kind of in a similar situation to the 8th and 9th centuries. In the 8th and 9th centuries, these barbaric families had control of all the monasteries throughout Europe and all the houses of education, and they were living with their dogs. There's this one great letter. Things are so bad. The barbarians are living with their dogs in the monasteries. Right? So what happened is that when they first started Cluny in the late 9th century, the idea of the reformers was that if we can run one monastery well, from that one monastery we can pray for and try to bring about the freedom of the Pope from the warring families in Rome. And then if the Pope becomes free, then the Pope could organize he could organize from Rome the freedom of the appointment of bishops and the creation of seminaries and the appointment of abbots to free in the various provinces or localities or nations the control of the church in those areas by the local warring families in those areas. And this led to some of the great historical events of the Middle Ages, but eventually from this Cluny monastery, 150 years later, I think 5 popes in a row come from Cluny, and they're all saints. And they do start to lead the reform of the church, right? From Rome. And this leads to kind of, I think this culminates, I mean, I would argue, Philip Hughes argues this culminates in the 13th century in basically Thomas Aquinas, right? It enables the rise of these great religious orders, which really help revitalize all of Catholicism in Europe.
Also, like Cluny's, like they had 6 abbots in a row that had really long lives.
Yeah.
So it actually had a great continuity over
Right.
a very long period of time.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
kind of interesting.
Yeah. So these reformers, these like Clutkin, Taparelli, Corci, they have this idea as well that if we're going to bring about this change in the church, the difference is that now we're not really being controlled by these barbarian tribes, but the church is subject to all these different factions that are in the states and the philosophical ideas they represent. So eventually Corci and Taparelli and Kleutken, they basically get into their heads like we gotta get Rome to at least correct the bad ideas of Hermes, because that'll give us an opportunity in Germany to get right-thinking people into the university chairs, right? Especially at Tübingen. So they get it, and in the 1830s they get Gregory the 16th to condemn the naturalism of Hermes, a number of his ideas, which gives them leverage then in going into Germany and trying to clean up the mess in Germany. Another scholar emerges in Germany, again in Gunther. And Gunther essentially says Hegel has given us such a challenge in the way he understands the Trinity and in the way he's trying to create a philosophy, basically subsume theology into philosophy, that you can only really meet that challenge. You can't use scholastic terminology to meet that challenge. So Gunther basically says, but there's a way you can use the resources of the church outside of scholasticism in order to meet the challenge of Hegel. And he spends his whole life up until the late 1950s or so, coming up with a school to combat Hegel, but using non-scholastic philosophy. And actually, Gunther's followers in Germany and Austria, they're pretty tough dudes, right? They fight for the church in all the right ways, and so Gunther ultimately and his followers, they do fall into some errors, but it's not malicious errors. It's like the typical errors that a good speculative philosopher or theologian might fall into just because we're all human. Well, anyway, Kleutken also under Pius IX, he basically gets several of the ideas of Gunther silenced, and then he gets Gunther himself silenced, because Gunther did make some mistakes, right? So, but Gunther accepted his the correction, you might say, from the Holy See, with a great Christian spirit. Like, I did my best, I tried what I could, and his movement kind of continued in various ways in Germany and Austria. There was a third fellow at the Gregorian who, as a seminarian, Taparelli and Curci, converted to Thomism. His last name was Pecci, Pecci. And they basically, between them, they become convinced that on the one hand, we have to try to address modern difficulties, right? We have to try to address the work, all the social problems that are being raised from 1830 to 1848. That basically, as philosophy is kind of dying out, there's all these various pragmatic, scientific, materialist, pragmatic solutions that are being applied. The Adam Smith capitalist on the one hand, the kind of more Marxian on the other. Others are just applying the power of the state, right? At the same time, in Germany during this time, you get there's Müller, and then after Müller there's von Ketteler. So basically, von Ketteler, and he sees these Germans who are getting, as a young man. Sorry, it's not von Ketteler, it's Müller. Müller sees these Germans during the famines of the 1820s getting on boats to go to the United States. And Müller basically goes and he starts interviewing. He realizes he realizes, I don't think anybody wants to leave their homeland, but so they must be leaving their homeland because something's not quite right. And so he basically starts interviewing all these ordinary Germans who are getting on these boats to go to places like Schulenburg, Texas, because Schulenburg was settled in the 1820s and 30s by Austrians and Germans. Actually, it's also interesting. Part of the Romantic movement, I've never studied this, but I think there's going to be I think if someone ever studied it, they'll discover that part of the Romantic movement in Austria and Germany were painters, a group of painters. They called themselves the Nazarenes, and their idea was to try to like update and modernize in a way the great techniques of the Middle Ages, because there was a strong movement in the 19th century among the more nihilist types to argue that, well, in the end, the medievals corrupted painting and art and music. So we need to free ourselves from that corruption. Kind of like the 1970s in the United States, right? Everything that's old and medieval is terrible, and we need to free ourselves from that and make ugly even more ugly churches. Boxes. Pardon? Yeah, they're also that's another school, but I never looked into this. But when I was reading about this, and then I went to Schulenburg, and you see all these painted churches in Schulenburg. It makes me think maybe the Germans or the Austrians that came to these churches, maybe they were Nazarenes. I mean, maybe they were part of this group of Catholic painters in Austria and Germany during the early 19th century. My research only goes as far as walking through the churches, and I know about this movement of the Nazarenes through my prior studies. So, but I never did the research to see if we could put two and two together. So that's for one of you too. Good teachers should always propose research projects for their students if they're interested. So, but you never know. I mean, maybe sometime when you're down there in Feather Rock and you have an extra time, you can start asking around and find out just if there's any common names, or, I'm sure you could find out who the artists were, and then track where those artists came from, where they were, in what schools they were trained, and therefore kind of what was their artistic, Anyway, so.
Sorry, but what is the center of art and intellectuals in Europe now? Is it
Right now, like in 2020?
No, I mean, is it that time? It's not my
In that time? Well, I just know there was this school that was from Italy to Austria to Germany of the Catholics. I would say, obviously, later in the 19th century, you start to get Impressionism would be the biggest movement.
Paris.
Yeah, in Paris. Probably Paris would be the center of art. But I think Impressionism comes after the 1850s. I'm not an art historian, but I think it's after the 1850s and into 1900. So another interesting fellow here. So basically, this becomes some of the first Catholic social teaching, right? So the Germans start to there are German bishops and priests who start to interview the workers, and then they start to basically say, well, how do we actually prevent, what do we have to do economically in order to prevent the workers from wanting to leave Germany and go to the United States or go wherever else they might be going, right? And they start to try to think through, what was done before, what was done before to make society stable so that workers got enough money to, by the way, a little aside. So there's this professor at Harvard. So Harvard in the 1920s somehow got a hold of the Medici family accounting books from 14th and 15th century Florence. They were the bankers of Florence, and they did a lot of banking with the textile manufacturers in Florence. And so this professor, I think, so this professor as a graduate student in Cambridge studied political theory of Florence, and kind of as a side project at one point, he did a paper on the Medici family finances. So when he got his PhD, he was applying for a job at Harvard Business School. He got his PhD in political theory. Then he applied for a job in Harvard Business School. His name is Sophus, Sophus. And so I went to a paper that he gave when I first got invited to Harvard. That's how he told me the story. So basically, he in his interview at Harvard, they asked him, would you ever be interested in doing research in the Medici family accounting ledgers? And he answered, yes, I would be. So he got hired. And then after he got hired, he discovered that when Harvard got these ledgers from some family, some wealthy man, some wealthy, Boston industrialist bought these ledgers from the Florentine archives, because that was like in the early 20th century. Because in the early 20th century there was this classical revival in the United States, and industrialists were trying to, or civic centers were trying to buy anything they could that evoked the medieval or the classical world. So this guy thought it'd be great, and apparently this industrialist, he kept these Medici ledgers in a prominent place in his library, even though he never read them. But when he gave them to Harvard, the stipulation by which he gave them to Harvard was that within 100 years, they had to be used for some major research project, or Harvard would have to give them back to the city of Florence. So they hired this guy in 2015, 2014, 2015. And after he was hired, they told him this. They told him basically, we have to produce by 2023, we have to produce a major research project on these ledgers, or we're going to lose them back to Florence. And so I think the guy kind of played the game a little bit. He timed the coming out of his final research project on these ledgers for 2023, the exact year that he's going to get tenure. Right, so it's perfect. So it's it turns out to be perfect timing. No, but I think he played him. They played him, and he played them back. Right, but so basically, what he did is he hired a bunch of graduate students to basically create data sets on these accounting ledgers, to figure out who they paid and how much they paid the workers and all this kind of stuff. And as it turns out, the best paid workers in many of the textile plants in Florence in the 14th, 15th century were women, right? Because they were the most skilled at doing the most refined work on whatever were the cloths and whatnot. A lot of the stuff that they made was for royalty and courts and things like that throughout Europe. But so it was actually the women textile workers who were the highest. They were the most valuable employees in a lot of these mills in the 15th and 16th centuries. So that was one of the conclusions of his. Because he got the typical Harvard graduate student question, about these ledgers, they're great. You're telling us about the economics of Florence and da 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 da. But what does this have to say about the role of women in the Middle Ages? So she asked the typical Harvard graduate student question. She actually asked it in a very snooty way. Also, I have to admit. And but anyway, he had the answer prepared for her. The women were actually the highest paid employees. But a lot of what Toparelli and Curci, what they were trying to do when it comes to, and then eventually Mueller, and then eventually von Kleutken, or von Kettler is the other big name. We'll get to him in a minute. But what they were trying to do is they were saying, well, what can we learn from these prior practices? What were they doing as far as justice, or what were they doing as far as thinking about the common good, so as to enable that everybody would make enough money so they could feed their family and pass on a little something to their kids when they died, right? And so they start to propose in German context things like the common good. They start to create a critique. They start to create a critique, both of Lockeanism in the English form, Lockean, Smith capitalism, but it's not a critique of just a wholesale critique. It's a critique where they say, well, actually, there's some things that they get right, and there's some things they don't get wrong, because they don't have something like the common good that's working their ideologies. They also critique Fichte, right? So, for example, Adam Mueller, who I was also telling you about, he's a critique of Smith because Smith is excessively individualistic. But he's also a critique of Fichte because Fichte understands that while there may be instances in which you have to protect an economy so they can grow, there also comes a point where you have to see, just as children grow, and at some point you have to see if they're adults and they can act in the world. So too with an economy, you may have to protect it so it can grow, but at some point you have to see if it can operate in the world, right? In competition maybe with other states. But what Mueller comes to see is that it's precisely the state that has the authority to harmonize, to understand the nature of the moral community, to understand the interconnections that exist between individuals and groups in the society, and to try to use authority to direct the various groups and individuals towards the common good. So Mueller, and I think Mueller, because of experiences of interviewing these workers, right, he was always he always tended to object to any sort of abstract economic theory that was come up with independent of social life as a whole. So he would object to the glorification of competition as the unique source of creative energy in life, of setting up personal independence and somehow as being against the members of the community or against the community as a whole. He was a critic of any form of individualist evolutionary capitalism, which started to become popular towards the end of his life. And through Mueller and then eventually Kleutken and then eventually von Ketteler, the Germans especially came up with this idea that we're working for the kingship of Christ, and we need to have Catholic laymen in society who are working in politics in order to bring about, right, to lessen the most damaging aspects of capitalism, to prevent the rise of any form of socialism or Marxism. Because they began to see that socialism and Marxism only arises when capitalism runs rampant and produces things like less than subsistence level wages for the workers, or you start to get women and children working in factories 18 hours a day and things like that, and people's health starts failing and things like that. In other words, the plight of the worker gets so bad they want to leave the country. So they began advocating for things like child labor laws and limited work weeks and not allowing women to work in factories and things like that, in Germany especially. This other fellow that they succeed in convincing the value of Thomism is Pecci, P-E-C-C-I. And so on the one hand, what you see developing, especially in Germany, but then Toparelli, as a Thomist who's aware of what they're trying to do in Germany, he also picks up on it, is what becomes Catholic social teaching. Then on the other hand, especially Kleutken, and especially Toparelli in Rome, and also Kleutken, who ends up in Rome, they start working on also this aspect of, if we're going to really critique, what they come up with is, if we're going to really be able to critique, whether it's Rousseauianism or Lockeanism or Adam Smith's economics or Hegelianism, what we need to do is we need a generation, we need to do for the church what the popes from Cluny and then eventually what Innocent III kind of becomes their model. If we're going to really have the buildup of the social kingship of Christ, we're going to need do for the church intellectually what Innocent III did and the Cluniacs did in a kind of quasi, church and state type way. We're going to have to, and if the best way to make this happen is that we need Thomists. We don't need robots of St. Thomas, but we need Thomists. We need to, on the one hand, have people that understand the developments of material society, who can distinguish those developments from the philosophical ideas that may or may not be related to those material developments, but who can also critique those philosophical ideas and theories, right, in a way that well, shows that faith and reason can be reconciled, and that the insights of St. Thomas Aquinas into the nature of God, into the nature of the human person, and into how God and man are united in the church, and therefore in society, that's the foundation upon which we can then educate, generations of priests, of scholars, of laymen who can engage in political life and social life to bring about the kingship of Christ, or to work towards the kingship of Christ. So they essentially conspire. They say, we have to get Thomism taught, at the very least at the beginning, in all Catholic seminaries. That's what they make as their goal. And we have to do it, first of all, by getting the Pope to get Thomism taught at all the seminaries in Rome. And you might say they're lucky, they're fortuitous, God is on their side. But their student Pecci, P-E-C-C-I, when he was elected Pope, he took the name Leo the 13th. Right? It's also the case that, so Taparelli and Kleutken, when Pius IX made this decision that I'm going to try to articulate doctrine and dogmas, which will basically give Catholics who are trying to organize in social and political life according to Catholic ideals, I'm going to give them like something to grab onto. It was basically, that was the origin of the magazine Civiltà Cattolica. And Taparelli and Kleutken were behind the putting together that magazine. Basically be a magazine that would try to articulate the ideas of the Pope, and maybe even sometimes to test ideas of the Pope before he would say things. But the idea behind a magazine was, well, a magazine can be very influential in forming opinion. And it's a way of forming opinion without the Pope having to make dogmatic pronouncements. So on the one hand, it can help to form ideas that maybe the Pope has in mind. On the other hand, it could test ideas that the Pope wants tested, so that when he does have to articulate something, he can say it in a way that's more acceptable. So Kleutken and Taparelli, they basically were able to get a lot of these early Thomists to be on the board of Civiltà Cattolica under the reign of Pius IX. And from there, they could do a lot of networking and building up institutions and building up scholars who could be the Thomists in at least the Roman universities, at least beginning there. So Leo XIII took as his model, when he became Pope, he took as his model Innocent III, right? Because Innocent III, and by the way, Innocent III has great writings on the importance of the family, the importance of the husband and wife, the nature of the family in society, the importance of the family for the future of society, the importance of the holiness of the family as well. He has some great writings on that. But Innocent III was also this great Pope who also promulgated the importance of the universality of the church and the universal destination of the church's message. So Leo XIII thought that he kind of took Innocent III as his model, that we have to help to reinvigorate a kind of model of the church which makes the church missionary, which makes the church universal, or which makes more manifest or more obvious the church's universal mission. Because why? Because he recognizes that somehow by his papacy, the church is losing its place in time and space, especially in Western countries. Right? It's no longer occupying the time and space that it used to occupy. And so somehow we need to reinvigorate that. Now, if there is by the way, on this thing I was mentioning about Gunther, there was a student of Kleutken His name was Sheben. Sheben's books. We use Sheben's books at Elmbrook when we teach our doctrine classes. Sheben basically realized he was a disciple of Kleutgen, but he realized the value of Gunther's attempts to try to refute Hegel. And so Sheben basically set out as a young man to come up with a kind of new synthesis. There was a Thomistic synthesis that would both offer a critique of Hegel, but would also bring about a reconciliation between Thomism and the school of Gunther. And I think he pulled it off. In fact, most people that write about Sheben in the 19th century, they say he was probably the greatest theologian of the 19th century, and he pulled off this kind of reconciliation of Gunther's Hegelianism with Kleutgen's Thomism. So, just FYI. But Sheben is still, I recommend that every center that is at a major important university where people think should have Sheben. They should have copies of Sheben. And if you get people who are really smart, you should give them Sheben. And they won't feel so smart anymore. But we should never feel that like we don't have sources that operate at the highest intellectual level. And I think Sheben is one of those go-to guys. If you need a go-to guy for that kind of thing, like, well, I mean, if you think you got some graduate student or professor who just thinks he's the toast of the town, as far as his level of genius and his knowledge of everything that is, right? You give him Sheben to help humble him, and if he can read and understand Sheben, he will at least feel that when he's reading Sheben, he's reading someone of his ilk. I mean, sometimes you got to be, if you're at a place where people do, if you're at a place where geniuses hang out, you got to be aware of that. And you got to be ready to give them food that will satisfy them.
Who else would you put in that category?
Aquinas.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the great Father Augustine, Aquinas, I would put in that category. Scheben's more modern, and since he deals with Hegel, right, he kind of a little bit deals more with those. I think Elizabeth Anscombe is someone who's in that realm in the 20th century.